There's been a blood shortage for a very long time. The synthetic blood that they're trying to make isn't a full replacement. This is just specific to red blood cells. First of all, red blood cells are bonkers. I agree. I'm actually glad you brought that up.
SciAnts. We get experimental science. We're curious, not judgmental.
All right, let's talk about synthetic blood, you guys. All right, there's been a blood shortage for a very long time. It got especially bad during COVID. But here's the thing. Blood transfusions save a lot of lives. If you're not a blood donor, think about being a blood donor. We're going to talk about synthetic blood. It's still not as good as the real thing. Okay, that's my PSA. The complicating factor about this is, number one, some blood types are pretty rare. And so even when there's always a shortage, or, there's not a robust supply, let's say, there's some blood types that just don't have access to the right kind of transfusion. And that's sort of your best case scenario. If you're out in the wilderness, for instance, if you're in a rural location, or you're even in a battle zone, like there's a place where a supply chain is breaking down, or you don't have immediate access to a hospital, like even rural, like I'm a rural girl, it can take 45 minutes, like out back my mom's way. It can sometimes take 45 minutes for an ambulance to get to you, and then they have to schlep you all the way to a hospital. Okay, so in addition to not having an abundance of fresh, genuine blood, there's also this issue of raw blood, like real blood, doesn't stay stable at room temperature. So it has like a 40-something day shelf life. I think it's like 42 days shelf life cold. But once it's been taken out to room temperature, it only has a few hours. And so fresh blood goes bad really easily. And so
we did have a question in chat of just like, in general, what the heck even is a red blood cell? It's just such a unique cell type.
Okay. First of all, red blood cells are bonkers. I agree. I'm actually glad you brought that up. There are many different cell types in blood. There are platelets, there are white blood cells, and there are red blood cells. Red blood cells are the ones, and occasionally there's other stuff knocking around in there, but for the most part, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about blood cells. Red blood cells are what give blood its color, and they're what transport oxygen around the body. And so they have hemoglobin inside of them. That's their primary function, is they bind oxygen and release it when sort of needed. And there's interesting little molecular switches that get flipped on and off inside the cell that tell the hemoglobin when to take an oxygen and when to release the oxygen. That's one of the, but it's mostly, it's just mostly hemoglobin. It's just hemoglobin on itself is toxic to the body. So it needs to be wrapped up in a little membrane, and it needs these little extra accessories to help, because hemoglobin likes to hang on to oxygen, so it needs to release oxygen at the right time as well. So it picks up oxygen when it's in the lungs and then goes to like distal parts of your body and release the oxygen where it's needed. It also picks up nitrous oxide, which can like mess around with the dilation of your blood vessels. So hemoglobin actually does a couple of things, but it's all related to like gas exchange. That's the function essentially of a red blood cell. They just transport gas, and they're wrapped up. So it's the hemoglobin, but they're wrapped up in a membrane that helps with fine tuning. And also, like I said, hemoglobin just loose in your blood is toxic, more or less. There's some people who will argue about it, but it's usually not great. Yeah. Okay, so synthetic blood, in theory, if it could do all of the things, would be stable for much longer. Hopefully not even necessarily needed to be refrigerated, right? Stable for longer under broader conditions, and maybe could be universal, or at least would be a way of getting around an individual's blood type if they're, for instance, in a rare group. That's the goal. We've had a few attempts at it in the past. There's this synthetic blood from a biotech company they're not quite there yet, but DARPA just gave them a massive grant. DARPA is like the research branch of the military, and with this infusion of money, they're saying they're hoping for human trials within the next 4 years, which is interesting. So they're still in animal trials now, but it's very promising. And I'm going to tell you guys about what they've done. But first, this just gives us a crash course. So that's called crash course. This gives us a brief rundown of all of the different stuff that is in blood. And the synthetic blood that they're trying to make isn't a full replacement. The idea is it's a stopgap. So we're very, very, very far away from actually having a fully synthetic blood, but something that will do the job to stabilize the patient until you can get to a place with more comprehensive medical facilities is the goal of the thing I'm going to tell you about. Okay, so I just want to remind you, so most of the stuff that is in your blood is like universal. Like we were just talking about plasma donations. You can donate plasma. That doesn't have this special cocktail of tagging, right? Like there's the A positive, B positive, O negative, etc. Those categories. This is just specific to red blood cells. That's all that this is talking about. So, but red blood cells are an important part of your blood. And so red blood cells, this specific different categories that we have of blood type that have to do specifically with our red blood cells is why we had so much trouble mastering blood transfusions for a very long time. Did you guys know they tried transfusing cow milk for a while before they stumbled upon saline? Yeah, and it kind of worked. I mean, listen, saline was way better, but they knew like sometimes blood transfusions worked and sometimes they didn't, and because they didn't understand that there are these different blood types. Again, caused by the red blood cell. So yeah, there is this famous doctor who was all about cow milk transfusions.
Pasteurized or unpasteurized?
I didn't ask. I don't know. That's actually a good question.
I'm sorry.
I don't know.
Just like goofy.
I mean, I'm gonna guess not pasteurized, but I could be wrong. But yeah, then it didn't really. I mean, it was going. It was trucking along, and then they found saline solutions, and they're like, "Whoa, this is way better." But yeah, cow milk. He said sometimes people got a little itchy, but they got over it. I know, I'm full of weird and sometimes not very useful information. Okay. It's a lot.
Important question here is there DNA in blood?
There is DNA in blood. There is not DNA in red blood cells, which is weird. The vast majority of cells have DNA in them. They're a little set of genetic instructions. Red blood cells don't have that. They also have kind of a short lifespan. They're just out there doing their protein thing, doing their oxygen transfer thing, and then they die. Your body is making millions of red blood cells like per second. It's ridiculous. It is ridiculous.
So if we get a transfusion of those red blood cells, you're not going to be a chimera on any level.
Well, it depends how we're defining chimera, and if you're getting a full blood transfusion, not just red blood cells, then you have other things in there. Depends how we're defining chimera.
So that depends on a lot of the definitions for your question. So I just thought that was irrelevant based on the question about sickle cell.
Yes. How does sickle cell anemia factor into receiving a transfusion? Well, if you have sickle cell anemia, you cannot be a donor, but one of the treatments for sickle cell is actually routine blood transfusions. So that is one of them. And ultimately, some of the long-term cures, kind of in quotes, is to replace bone marrow, either with a donor or with a genetically modified version of your own bone marrow, to start producing the unmodified cell type. Yeah.
And it's the same antigen considerations, yeah?
Yes, it is, yeah. Okay. All right. So you guys, we're almost there. I wanted to tell you about this synthetic blood. And I call it a synthetic blood. That's how people refer to it. It's erythromer is the name of it. There's a lot of different types of synthetic blood out there. But like I said, this one is really interesting because it's come up with some clever workarounds for packaging the hemoglobin, essentially. The little thing the molecules that help with this gas exchange that collect oxygen from your lungs when they're in your lungs and then carry it to the distant parts of your body. That's one of the key things that we need synthetic blood to do. And for a stopgap, this has been developed and proposed. So they have some unique ways of doing this. So what's interesting is the synthetic blood that they have created is actually stored as a powder, and it's shelf stable for 2 years. And then when you're ready to use it, you mix it with saline. But saline solution is pretty readily available, at least a lot more so than a big old bag of blood. Okay, all right. You might be asking, where is he getting hemoglobin? He just has this hemoglobin hanging around? Because other people have done similar things, like from cow's blood and stuff. No, this is human hemoglobin. Where is he getting the human hemoglobin? You know how I told you guys that blood in the blood bank has like a 40-something day shelf life, and then that's it, you can't use it? His lab takes expired human blood and harvests the hemoglobin out of it, and then repackages it for this purpose, which is cool. You know, hey, it's expired. No one's going to use it. They're going to just dump it. They're going to dispose of that bad boy as a biohazard. He just takes it.
It's clever.
Yeah.
Agatha was wondering, why don't we modify E. coli to produce the blood cells?
Well, E. coli, I don't think can generate cells themselves, because E. coli are just sad little cells as well. We might be able to get yeast or something to make the hemoglobin protein. We can engineer these things to make proteins, but we're not really at the point of getting them to make cells. Even if we could do that, there's still a need to keep any living cell needs to be maintained, right? So like refrigerated or frozen or whatever. And so I think they're trying to solve both of these. First of all, yes, we do have a blood shortage, but also, more importantly, getting something that can act as a stopgap in like remote situations that will keep a person alive until they reach more well-established medical facilities. All right, sorry, here we go. Yeah, so he harvests hemoglobin from the used, like from the expired. Okay, so this is his synthetic blood. This gentleman's synthetic blood is the one that just received that big DARPA grant. And so they're hoping to go into human models, like a human clinical trial in the next couple of years. I believe he said 4 years. This interview is a little bit on the older side. So what he's been able to do is he harvests the hemoglobin. In an interview, he said that they're looking at other sources of getting hemoglobin. If they really need to scale this up, then they're not going to be able to just rely on expired blood bank blood. But for now, that's what they're using. So they get human hemoglobin, and then they've actually come up with a very, very clever way of repackaging it it's like a lipid layer. It looks very similar to the membrane that we have on our cells. So they've been able to recreate this in a lab. They have a way of packaging it so that it's packaged very similarly to our cells. Right. So I was just rounding out what it is they've been able to do with this particular kind of synthetic blood. So they're able to harvest the hemoglobin. They're able to package it in a way that is very similar to how our cells are packaged. The biochemistry around this is really pretty sophisticated, but it's in these tiny little particles. They're actually a little bit smaller than red blood cells, but really nicely packaged. And then they're dehydrated, made into a powder where it's stable, the hemoglobin and this little coating that looks like the membrane of your cell, essentially similar, stable for years. And then you can rehydrate it with salt water, like a sterile salt water, just a saline solution. And at least in mice and rabbits, where they've transfused more than 50% of their blood. Mice, they've done 70%, and rabbits, it's 50%. They're able to replace this substitute with like 50% in the animals, and they still do fine. And so again, as he was saying in the interview, this is not meant to be a fully synthetic blood, but as a stopgap in places where they don't have storage, for instance, for all of the different blood types. So in like emergency situations. And so that's really cool. Anyway, they just got this big DARPA money. We're going to be keeping our eye on it to see when it goes human clinical trials in a couple of years. I'm sure we'll still be here chatting with you guys about it, so we'll give you an update.
Nice.
But that was it. I thought it was neat technology, and it was an area that we haven't really talked about too much.
That is really cool.